So today we're going to talk about clothing and food and get into some controversies that we find with the teachings in early Buddhism. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. So one of my viewers, Kez B, asked a couple questions about clothing, and in particular the clothing that monastics wear, and how that can inform our own practice. And I dealt with one of those questions on a prior video. And today I'm going to get to, I think, what is actually a somewhat meatier issue. So what Kez asks is, what would be the way to apply the principles that originally gave rise to the patchwork robes, but in today's context, that is the patchwork robes of monastics? He asks, am I right in my understanding that it was about practicing humility, non-attachment, and not being wasteful? Could application of these principles today include things like buying second-hand clothes from stores where the money goes to charity, and seeking out clothing produced with a principle of no harm or minimal harm? So this is a wonderful question, and one I think that we can all benefit from considering. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a good deal of time at the beginning here discussing what early Buddhism tells us, in particular if we look at aspects of the Pali Canon. And then later on I'll discuss ways in which we can perhaps take a contemporary view towards this question and other related questions, because we're going to see that this is actually, in a certain sense, a part of a larger issue within early Buddhism. So first of all, the issue with patchwork robes. Let's just get this out of the way, that patchwork robes, the idea of wearing patchwork robes, was an ideal within early Buddhism. So what is a patchwork robe? Well, in early Buddhism there was the idea that wearing a robe was somewhat of a luxury, at least within, certainly in its, probably in its earlier strata, in other words, probably when the Buddha started, or if we compare early Buddhism, the very earliest Buddhism, with perhaps other people doing renunciant work. And so what they would do is to make a robe, they would go, let's say, to the charnel ground, which is one of the ways that in ancient India they would dispose of dead bodies. They would put them out on a ground so that they could return to the earth and return to animals that would come and feed. And so these people would take the clothing that these bodies had on them, or the shrouds that they were wrapped in. They would clean them, and then they would patch them together into clothing for themselves. Or they would take cast-off clothes, cast-off pieces of fabric, and patch them together. And we have to remember this is in a society where cloth itself was valuable. We tend nowadays to think of cloth as almost as a commodity, but in those days, of course, all cloth had to be made by hand, had to be woven by hand. So it was while it was something that people had, it was something that was also something of a luxury because it took a lot of time to make. So it was something of an ideal within the early Sangha to have a patchwork robe, and presumably that's for the reasons that Kez elaborates on. That is, because of humility, non-attachment, this idea of not being wasteful. But this is also something which understand was only an ideal. And this takes us to the main point of this early section that I want to discuss, which is the arrival of, or the person of Devadatta, who was the Buddha's cousin. And Devadatta within early Buddhism is something of a figure of evil. He's somebody who tried to attack the Buddha. He tried apparently to kill the Buddha on at least a couple of occasions. At least that's what we hear in parts of the Vinaya, or the Chulavaka, which is one of the books of the Vinaya. Vinaya being the early texts of Buddhist rules for the saṅgha, for the monastics. And these rules also include stories along with them. And in this case, there's a story about Devadatta and how Devadatta felt that the early Sangha, or actually the Sangha that was probably pretty advanced, had become too lax, had become too relaxed, had become too easy in some sense. And while it's not clear that anything had changed, it may simply have been that Devadatta felt that the Sangha needed reform, that the Sangha needed to be a bit more Puritan in its efforts, a bit more rigorous in its efforts. And so Devadatta suggested 5 changes to the Buddha. 5 changes that he felt that the Sangha needed. First was that monks should live under trees and not in dwellings, not in houses. This is obviously because a house is much easier to live than under a tree. Under a tree is more of a rigorous kind of practice. The second was that monastics should live in the forest and not in villages, presumably because within villages there was a lot of temptation, potential temptation. The life was easier. It was easier to get food. It was easier to go an alms round. But you were less separated from society in a village, whereas in the forest you really were by yourself. The third of these changes is that monastics should always wear rag robes or patchwork robes, and not wear robes that were given to them as gifts by lay people. And here we see, in this third one, great evidence that in fact most monastics probably didn't wear patchwork robes. It was probably the case that the Buddha, in fact it was the case that the Buddha allowed that lay people could donate robes, clothing to the monastics as part of their donation, as part of their dana, or the way that the lay people supported the early monastic order. Along with food and medicine and lodging, lay people could also give robes. So Devadatta felt that that was too lax, that was making things too easy. That it was better to go back or to go to a different system. It's not clear that he was going back, but in any event, go to a different system where everyone wore only the more strict rag robes or patchwork robes. Now, the fourth thing that Devadatta wanted to institute in the Sangha was that everyone be vegetarian. They were not vegetarian at the time, and we're going to talk about that. And fifth was that monastics should always only eat food from alms round. In other words, that they would go on alms round to the village, they would get their food given to them in their alms bowl, and then they would eat the food from the alms round. And that they would not be fed by invited parties to people's houses. And this clearly was something that happened. In fact, in the Pali Canon, there are various stories of the Buddha himself, or the Buddha and monks, or monks, lots of groups of monks, were invited to the houses of lay people, usually I would expect a wealthy lay people, and given a meal. And that was a way that monastics could be fed without actually having to go on alms round. So these are 5 ways that Devadatta felt that the early Sangha, the Sangha under the Buddha, was too lax. And he suggested that it be changed. And the Buddha, in response, rejected this. He did not want to adopt any of these measures as mandatory. Of course, an individual monk could, in certain ways, keep one or the other of these with certain caveats, but in general, this is up to personal opinion. But he did not want to make this a rule for the whole Sangha. And when the Buddha objected, Devadatta then created a schism in the Sangha. In other words, he broke off from the Buddha with, it's said, 500 monks and went on his own. And then it's also said that 2 of the disciples of the Buddha, the main disciples of the Buddha, Sariputta and Moggallana, went to these monks when Devadatta wasn't around and got them all to return to the Sangha. And then later on, Devadatta died under supernatural circumstances, so to speak. So, I mean, there's clearly elements of this story that are legendary. I would say it's pretty clear that this is not intended to be an accurate recounting of what happened, but in any event, it gives us a picture of the early Sangha, a picture of differences of opinion with the Buddha, a picture of how the Buddha practiced in the early Sangha, the sorts of things that were important to him and the sorts of things that weren't important to him. And we have to remember, thinking of Devadatta's 5 points, that when the Buddha first attained enlightenment, his main aim, his main approach, his main thrust was called the middle way. At that time, the middle way really had one key meaning, because middle way can mean the middle between almost any two things. But at the time of his enlightenment, the middle way meant the middle way between indulgence and asceticism, because in the Buddha's own life story, he grew up in conditions of relative indulgence in a wealthy family, in a powerful family. He left that family in order to spend several years practicing various forms of extreme austerity. The extreme austerity is generally I would say there is some controversy, but in general, people tend to believe that it was a Jain austerity, Jainism being another philosophy around at the same time of the Buddha. It was a competitor of the Buddha, and the Buddha had discussions and arguments with Jains, and the Jains were much more ascetic than the Buddhists, in particular in certain of the ways that Devadatta was interested in. Jains were always vegetarian. Jains, some of them didn't wear clothes at all. They generally approached life as trying to do the least harm they could in every respect. So you will see Jains, there are still Jains today, who wear masks so that they don't accidentally inhale insects. They will take brushes around with them and brush the ground in front of them so that they don't accidentally trod on an insect or step on an insect. And these are ways that Jains approach life. And in most extreme Jainism, there's the ideal that one simply ceases to do any kind of activity at all, because really any kind of activity will in certain ways harm certain things. So one is supposed to refrain from all activity and eventually starve oneself to death, because in that way one is doing the least harm to everyone else except oneself, and by acting with such extreme altruism, one is thereby gaining the kind of top honors, or the awakening of Jainism, basically. And the Buddha was pretty clearly pushing back strongly against that kind of view. So the Buddha's opinion was that Jainism was one extreme, or that at least the practices that Jains used was one extreme, and other groups, other people also use similar kinds of practices. And in particular, in the Amaganda Sutta, which is a sutta in the Sutta Nipata, which is an early collection of Buddhist suttas, the Buddha talks in particular, or actually it's not the Buddha, it's supposedly an earlier Buddha, talks about the practice of vegetarianism. And this is not a sutta that's often discussed, because it's a sutta that argues against extreme forms of vegetarianism, saying that it's not the eating of meat that's the problem, it's the way our mind is, it's the way that we live our lives. And it compares vegetarianism with other ascetic practices, such as fasting or singing hymns or doing kinds of penances. So in this way, in this sutta, we can see a kind of either the Buddha's own view, or at least an early Buddhist view, which is to compare vegetarianism with kinds of asceticism. On the other hand, we also know that trading in meat was considered wrong livelihood in early Buddhism. So this is one of the parts of wrong livelihood that lay people are not supposed to be involved with. Now, it's not clear exactly how expansive that definition was. Did it include only slaughterhouses? Did it include being a butcher? What did it include? It's not entirely clear, I think, from the texts. But in any event, there's some I would say tension within early Buddhism about this, because trading in meat was thought of as simply wrong livelihood. It was not considered ethical, basically, along with trading in poisons and trading in alcohol. And in perhaps one of the most important suttas where he discusses vegetarianism or eating meat is the Jivaka Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, where the Buddha says basically that his view is that you shouldn't eat any meat that you feel that you either see or hear or suspect has been killed specifically for you. So, in other words, he would refuse, or he would have the monastics refuse to eat any kind of meat that was sort of presented to them as an offering, in the sense that it was sacrificed for them, because that to the Buddha was unethical. That to the Buddha was not right action. On the other hand, if the meat was simply meat that was either produced for some other occasion, or that was not killed specifically for them, it was just slaughtered for general usage, then the Buddha didn't see any particular problem in eating it. And if you're interested in hearing more about a traditional view of this, there's a video by Bhante Vimalaramsi, which I can put up on the screen here, where you can see what a traditional Theravada monastic has to say about that sutta and the reasoning behind it. Basically, in the early Buddhist view, ethics came down to intention. Did you have an intention to do harm? And if you didn't have an intention to do harm, then there was no particular problem and you're doing a particular thing. Now, I think all of us can see certain issues with this, certain problems, certain ways in which, let's say, eating meat may perpetuate certain kinds of ills in society or in the world. You know, I myself am not a vegetarian, although I do work to reduce my intake of meat, as well as to try to find out where the meat comes from. Because as we all know, there are better and worse sources of animals and meat. Meat can be produced by very unethical ways, and it also can, animals can be kept by people who are much more careful and much more kind. So there are various ways that we can practice with this, and I'll get back to that a little bit at the end. Now, in later Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism in particular, vegetarianism became more of a typical practice. And so we will find in forms of Chinese Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, Korean Buddhism, that the people who are practicing Buddhists or monastics will often be vegetarian, because within that culture, within the Japanese and Chinese and Korean cultures, that grew up as a part of the practice. As many of the, I should say, traditional practices of monastic Buddhism from the early stratum tended to die out. For example, going on alms round just ceased to be such an important part of the daily life of monastics within these other cultures. A monastic culture changed with the times. On the other hand, within Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism, people are not vegetarians. Now, it's said that that's partly because in Tibet it's very difficult in the high plateaus to survive on a vegetable lifestyle. And so there's a video, there are several, but there's one video by Matteo Ricard, who's a Tibetan monastic, who discusses this. I'll try to put this up on the screen here, so if you're interested in his take on sort of Tibetan views, that's one. But in general, as we get to Mahayana Buddhism, later Buddhism, the practice becomes less one of a personal practice, trying to, let's say, purify your own intentions, your own personal intentions towards the world, and becomes a more global kind of enterprise, where you're interested in saving all sentient beings, where you're becoming a bodhisattva, which is a being that postpones awakening potentially an infinite amount of time in order to save all sentient beings. And as that became more of the ideal changed. And then the ideal took on these issues such as vegetarianism, where the idea was to do as little harm as possible to the broader world. So to point to one interesting comparison here, most people, I think, if asked about Buddhism or the Buddha's beliefs, would expect that he would be a vegetarian, but wouldn't have any particular problem with drinking alcohol. Whereas, in fact, insofar as we know about the historical Buddha, he was actually the reverse. He didn't particularly care about eating meat as long as it wasn't killed specifically for you, but on the other hand, he did have a problem with drinking alcohol, because he saw that as a way of making more problematic your own intentions. Because when you're under the influence of a drug like alcohol, your intentions can tend to become less pure. And the question, of course, in all these cases is, how much of a Puritan was he? Did he believe that we shouldn't drink any alcohol, or should only just not get drunk? And there's differences of opinion about this. There are stricter monastic opinions, I think more orthodox opinions, which is that alcohol is wrong under every circumstance. And then there are more liberal opinions, either lay opinions or liberal monastic opinions that are a little bit more forgiving about that, talking about alcohol is fine in small doses, but not more than that. So to come back to Kesby's question, which I don't want to leave out of the picture here, what Kesby was asking is, should we return to some ideal of early Buddhism, which reflects this notion of patchwork robes, where we are concerned about buying clothing in a way that is most kind to the world. In other words, either buying used clothing so that it doesn't have to be made by somebody, so it doesn't involve the expenditure of lots of resources that are finite. So we buy used clothing, maybe we buy clothing from a store that donates to charity or that itself is a charity. And we can ask the same thing using Devadatta's, or two of Devadatta's 5 issues about eating meat, about food. Should we live our lives? Should we live our lives trying to do as little harm as possible in every circumstance? And in that circumstance, should we either strive to be vegetarians or vegans, or should we cut down on our eating of meat? And I think these are questions that we have to practice with nowadays. Clearly, there's no reason to believe that the Buddha was right about everything, or that we have to follow the Buddha's advice on everything. That's part of the issue I find with an overly strict interpretation of early Buddhism, is that we can't allow ourselves to be confined by the strictures of the very earliest form of Buddhism, because clearly there are things that we may need to change. There are things that don't fit with our lifestyle nowadays. There are things that may not fit with our understanding of the world nowadays. There are things that may not fit with the way the world is nowadays. And so what I would suggest, though, is that we do keep in mind the Buddhist notion of a middle path, of not trying to go to extremes in ways that are harmful to ourselves or to others. So in other words, there's a way of overdoing any one of these things. And I think that is perhaps the biggest danger, one big danger, is that we not allow ourselves to become obsessed with some aspect of Buddhist practice, or of any kind of practice, such that the practice itself becomes a hindrance, such that the practice itself becomes a daily stress. If that's what happens, then I don't think the practice is to our benefit, even if we may think that by stressing ourselves out, we're doing greater help to the world. It may be the case, but I would argue often it's not the case. Often, by stressing ourselves out, we may simply be making more of a problem in the world for other people to solve. And so I think whatever we decide in these cases, whether we decide to shop at secondhand clothing stores, which I think is a great idea, whether we decide to become vegetarians, which I think is also a great idea if you want to do that, then do it. Behave your life as you think most fit, as you think makes the least harm. And that way, if we do that with a calm way, with a relaxing around the stress, without being dogmatic about it, then I think we're doing the greatest help we can. So in general, I would say, be kind to yourself. Don't do things that are harmful to yourself, and be kind to the world. Don't do things that are harmful to the world. And many of these practices that we've discussed are both kind to yourself and kind to the world. Whatever we decide to do, to relax around dogmatism. So if you're interested in getting into more in depth about topics like these, check out my Patreon page. It's one that I have recently set up. I'm really glad to have all of you here. It's so wonderful to have such a wonderful audience, I think an audience interested not only in hearing, but also in practicing, and in getting to know these texts, and getting to know not only early Buddhism in itself, which is so interesting, but in getting to know a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled way of living life, wherever that comes from, whether it comes from early Buddhism, whether it comes from aspects of the Mahayana, whether it comes from aspects of other philosophical traditions around the world, or whether it simply comes out of an understanding in modernity that there are certain ways that we can live nowadays that are kinder and wiser. So thanks so much for being here, and we will catch you on the next one of these videos. And be well.